As a forever GM, I've always appreciated when a game gives me tools to help bring its vision to life, and even ease up on the prep that I need to do for the session. And one space that I always struggled as a GM was with the stories surrounding the monsters that players faced, but more importantly, making the battles with them do justice to the story that led up to fighting that creature. And that's why when we started designing our own TTRPG, one of the first outlines I wrote was the guideline on how to create entities for our Bestiary. And that set a foundation for our monsters that tells a story through the mystery and that the players lead through right up until they face it. Hi, I'm Ryan, lead designer of Ethereal here at Fineground Cryptids. If you want to see live examples from the Bestiary itself, make sure to check out the link in the description below for access to the Discord, where our quick guide and the Bestiary are both available for free. As I mentioned in the intro, for our game, we've worked really hard to make each entity in the Bestiary have a story tied to it and feel unique. We want each to be able to be run by a GM fairly easily, almost being built in a way that works as a little module without the heavy details. How do we do that? Well, it starts by giving the GM some key elements that'll help them understand the entity right away. Each stat block gives a summary at the top of the entity's profile. It gives their behaviors, traits, common habitats, their language or voice, because as a GM, I like to make creature sounds, and I think this might help guide other GMs on how to do so. And it also includes things that they might eat and what they might be mistaken as, which is crucial in a game about cover-ups and conspiracy theories. At the end of the stat block, we also provide a few tables to help generate scenarios for the GM on the fly. We have an encounter generator which offers 3 narrative beats. One of our design rules is to almost always include at least one encounter where the entity isn't a threat, but instead is the objective that needs rescuing or protection even. This gives variety and it encourages GMs to not always go the route of every entity is a threat, and sometimes gives the players different objectives that they have to go for. We have some suggestions for basic entity design to help the GM come up with a description if needed, or even drive inspiration for what the creature looks like. And then finally, we have a small loot table. Our game isn't designed around looting. However, this table is important because it can also be used to help drive inspiration for story elements. It gives some more personality to the entities on the things that they carry with them or the things that they've picked up along their own journey as whatever entity they are. And then we also have for each entity a small block at the end that gives some quick tips on how to play the entity effectively in combat, allowing most GMs to be able to pick it up and understand what the design and gameplay goals are with it. In the guideline that we designed for building entities, we also have one more rule, and that is that every entity needs a feature that connects back to its lore somehow. It doesn't matter if the feature is niche, but it needs to exist. For example, Bigfoot has to make an intelligence saving throw if it hears music within 500 feet, and on failure, it has to go investigate the source of that music. This plays into the curiosity nature that Bigfoot's lore has in our game, and even its appreciation for rhythm. This is something GMs can tap into if they wish, acting as a way to feed a possible clue to players on how to possibly lure it in. It's not an element we'd expect to come up in every instance, but we could still see it being something that comes up from time to time or something that the GMs might be able to get creative with. These features are just a few lines, but they breathe an identity into the stat blocks and give the players and GM some idea of what the entity is meant to be like, what its own personal likes or dislikes are, while having some sort of rule to follow. Now that's just the base bones of running the entity, but Ethereal, as some of you might know, is very centered around the idea of players solving mysteries. They're often thrown into the deep end of something strange going on, and they need to connect the dots to find the entity and most likely stop it. Along the journey, they need to find clues to help them get advantage in any possible fight against the target. With that in mind, we need elements that the GM can hint at throughout the mystery, which ultimately gives clues to the coming crisis. So with that, there are a few gameplay mechanics that were designed. The first is saps. Normally, players get the ability to create 1 of 4 essences in combat that empower them. I've touched base on this in a few of my videos. But some enemies get a sap that steals a particular essence and empowers them instead. Throughout the mystery, saps are a good element that GMs can hint at. Perhaps a local saw the shadows pulling in towards the alleyway. That could suggest to the players that there's a forsaken sap tied to this entity that they're hunting. A next gameplay element is another one that I've spoken about a few times in our other videos, the telegraphed attack. For those not familiar, it's essentially a powerful attack that the players only have a few turns to figure out before it activates and something devastating happens. Telegraphed attacks are a trove of possible clues that the GM can sprinkle for the players. They could suggest which skill check is needed to investigate Bigfoot's telegraphed attack, or maybe they could have a local speak about a strange instance that they saw that suggests what the ability does. If the GM is feeling gracious enough, they could even suggest ways to stop it in advance. Perhaps someone threw a torch at the entity and caused its mighty roar to stop, suggesting heat damage is needed to prevent this attack. Next we have coatings. You can't have a game with vampires and werewolves and not have a way to burn away at them. Coatings are various items that players can apply to their weapons and their casting components, and when used against specific enemies that are weak to them, disable some capabilities that they have. But I should note, coatings don't always just do extra damage, because that wouldn't be interesting. Sometimes they disable parts of the entity's stat block entirely, or open up other possible ways to defeat them. By taking these elements and dripping them into our entity stat blocks, we have instantly giving our GMs dozens of clues that they sprinkle throughout the mystery, but at the same time are not essential for the players to find. They'll certainly make fights more doable and manageable, and the players are encouraged to find them. But they're also not the sort of clues that ruin the mystery if not found. It'll just make the fight a lot tougher if they are not connecting these dots along the way. Most importantly, these elements blur the lines between out of combat and in combat. You take your character knowledge into the fight with you, and perhaps even if you couldn't connect the clue as to why the shadows were being drained into the alleyway, when you see the enemy activate Forsaken Sap, the dots begin to connect. Suddenly that creature doesn't feel like it was just in a cutscene earlier. It has a set of rules that it plays by, regardless if it is or in-out combat. It's part of the world, and it is affecting the world around it. Now, speaking of rules, we get into my favorite guideline that we have for building our entities, and that's break the rules of the guideline. We realized fairly early on that not every entity design concept is going to fit into the basic idea of a stat block of a few attacks, a few abilities, a feature, and maybe a telegraphed attack. And though telegraphed attacks allow us to further the identity of an entity, giving them something very powerful and unique, it wasn't always enough to do some very weird designs. So instead of trying to force a square into a circle hole, we learned that some entities will just be weird, and we're okay with that. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing we did was create a separate type of entity stat block called domain entities. These came from the inspiration of something like Pennywise the Clown, this eldritch horror that can seemingly appear almost anywhere in town and is able to shape the reality around it, or at least the perception of reality of those in its town, or as we call it, their domain. The idea of a domain enemy is to make the players feel like there is a presence around them even if the entity is not right next to them, and it gives the GM the tools of how to make it feel like the entity is affecting the world. A domain could be as big or as small as the GM sees fit. Perhaps it's a town for an eldritch clown, or a castle inhabited by a vampire lord, or one of our earliest tests, the Jolly Roger, a ghost pirate that had taken over a small farming town. Domain enemies have two core parts to their kits, their laws and their actions. Laws act similar to features, but add some further flavor. Like the Jolly Roger having citizens losing money and appearing in front of itself as gold doubloons, or causing nearby ships to sink if they get too close. Domain laws can also contain freedoms or limiters. Certain triggers act as objectives for the entity or the players. Freedoms act as a narrative tool that, if an objective is met, the entity is free to no longer confined to the limits of its domain and becomes more powerful. The Jolly Roger, for example, gets theirs triggered on killing someone that has wronged it in its past life or recovering a lost treasure. Limiters are ways to weaken an entity within its domain. For a vampire lord, having its coffin burn makes it much easier to target for the players. Domain actions are like actions for this entity, but generally have longer cooldowns and take time to activate and affect the world rather than a direct space in front of the entity. They represent the entity controlling elements of its own domain, like the Jolly Roger's ability to summon a ghostly crew to attack the players when it sees fit, cause objects to float, or even cause lower intelligence creatures to become possessed. Domain laws and actions give story elements to the GM to work with as the players move towards the final entity, once again creating an overarching connection. In our playtest campaign, the players investigated a small town where children were going missing and people are claiming that money was vanishing out of thin air. It turns out that there was a Jolly Roger trapped in a cave from hundreds of years ago, and now it's exacting its revenge on the town by possessing children and luring them into the cave to free itself and its old treasure, and the players had to rush there and stop it before it freed the treasure and itself. Once the players got there, they already had a few ideas of what to expect, and the final fight led into a full-blown stat block of the entity, a combination of attacks, abilities, and even a telegraphed attack. And though this was the first time they were seeing the foe in person, the domain gave them the sense that it was something that was looming around them the entire time. Another entity we have is unlike anything else in the game, and it is basically a full set piece on its own, the Death Worm. Inspired by Tremors and Dune, these massive worms can swallow anything in a single bite, leveling towns with ease. So how do the players fight something like that? Well, the idea is the Death Worm on its own is not a fight where the players just shoot at and stab it. That wouldn't really make sense to be able to fight something so large with just bullets, swinging your sword, and a little bit of magic. No, the stat block for the Death Worm is basically an arena, giving the GM rules on what the players will need to do to stop it, sharing rules of how climbing on it works, and while on its back or inside of it, there are these parasites that they need to fight off as they're trying to take this thing down. It's built upon the idea that the player characters are human at the end of the day, but it gives them a cool cinematic masterpiece of how they can possibly take it on, while there's still this real threat knowing that they need to stop this thing before it maybe makes it to a nearby town. As we've gone through and designed more and more entities for the game, we've kept pushing the bar on breaking the barrier between narrative and combat, making sure that they bleed together. This video just scratched the surface and didn't even get into one of our weirdest stat blocks, the Mothman, who actually acts more of a quest giver than a threat. But more for that in another video. I hope you enjoyed me pulling back the curtain on our monster design. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.